He stood alone in a place coated in dust and indifference. The border collie, matted and favoring a twisted leg, trembled under the weight of the crowd's jeering silence. Not a single hand was raised. Not one. Murmurs called him broken, a problem that couldn't be fixed. The auctioneer, his voice weary, was about to declare it over when, in that final moment, a man no one had noticed quietly raised his hand. There were no words, no hesitation, just a single, simple gesture that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have imagined. What was it about this dog that drew a stranger from the shadows? And what was the secret of the man who walked straight into the silence everyone else avoided? This story will take you deeper than you expect. It is a journey of reckoning, of rescue, and of a bond that might just change how you see the world. The livestock auction in rural Pennsylvania was no place to find tenderness. Between the haze of kicked-up dirt, the clang of metal gates, and the constant shouts of men pricing working animals, there was barely room to breathe. Yet on that day, something shifted. The noise fell away into a pocket of silence. It wasn't the loudest bull or the finest horse that had captured the attention. It was a dog. He had entered from a side gate, slinking in like a shadow, a male border collie mix. His black and white coat was caked in mud and matted over old wounds. One of his back legs was drawn up, as if it had given up months ago. His ribs showed beneath the thin fur, and the faint mark of a faded collar was cinched around his neck like a memory that couldn't be forgotten. He didn't bark or beg. He just stood there, trembling slightly, as if he knew his fate was being decided by a gallery of strangers. The auctioneer, who usually moved with the force of a locomotive, stumbled over his words. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. That one's finished. Not worth the food to feed him. Probably bites, I bet. No one bid. There wasn't even a glance of pity. The silence that surrounded him wasn't born of respect, it was indifference. He wasn't a dog, he was a liability with a heartbeat. Just as the auctioneer prepared to bang his gavel and move on to the next lot, a hand rose quietly in the back. It didn't wave or shout, just a calm, steady gesture, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Every head turned, a wave of murmurs spread. No one knew the man. He wore a worn flannel jacket and boots that looked like they'd walked more roads than the auction house trucks. Caked in Appalachian mud, his hair was graying at the temples, and a faded scar ran along his jawline like a map to a past he never spoke of. He gave no name and made no sound, but a single, firm nod carried more weight than a wad of cash. The gavel fell. People blinked, confused. Why would a man like that want a dog like that? Was it pity, a mistake, or something else that none of them could understand? The man walked slowly down the aisle. He didn't hesitate, and the dog didn't flinch as he approached. The border collie stood on his trembling legs, a flicker of light returning to his amber eyes, like a dying ember stirred by a breeze. The man knelt beside him. He didn't reach out or pull, just placed a hand, open and patient, on the dog's shoulder. Then, something no one expected happened. The dog, just slightly but unmistakably, leaned into the touch. It was the gesture of a creature that hadn't known a kind hand in years. There was no growl, no whimper. He simply rested his body against the man's leg and breathed. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, but everyone there felt it. It was the moment two broken things remembered how to hold each other up. Someone captured the scene on their phone. The video, showing nothing more than a stranger and a dog standing silently amidst the chaos of the auction, was enough. It went viral, but the reason the man had raised his hand, the story hidden in his eyes, and what the dog was about to do next, that would force everyone to question how much pain it takes to lead a man back home. The road home was a ribbon of cracked asphalt, fringed by rust-colored trees clinging to the last breath of fall. The old truck groaned over every pothole, as if complaining. Jacob Miller said nothing, his hands firm on the steering wheel, his eyes on the road, but his gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror. There, the dog was curled up in the truck bed, quiet, his eyes half closed but never fully asleep. With every bump in the road, he tensed, as if expecting the world to turn cruel again. But this wasn't the auction house anymore, and Jake was not like the others. His cabin, tucked away on the edge of the woods in Hanamaki, Pennsylvania, was a place only the lost ever found, surrounded by pine trees and silence. It was half swallowed by the forest, a leaning porch giving it a lopsided personality. Jake had lived there alone for years. No visitors, no deliveries, just an old wood stove, a pile of firewood stacked with military precision, and a bed that had forgotten what it meant to be shared. Jake had never brought anything home before, until now. He carried the dog in his arms as if handling something sacred. Afraid to wake a ghost, the dog didn't resist, only shivered slightly, his breath shallow, as if unsure he had earned the right to rest. Jake laid him on an old blanket by the stone fireplace, adding another for good measure, and then built a fire. Nursing the flickering flames, warmth slowly spread to the corners of the room. Still, the dog didn't close his eyes. That night, Jake made a simple stew. The dog didn't eat, he didn't move, he followed Jake's every motion, his eyes tracking every sigh, every time a hand moved near something sharp or hot. It wasn't fear, it was vigilance. Someone had once taught him that silence could turn to violence in an instant. Jake didn't push, he gave no commands. Instead, facing the fireplace, he spoke, barely a whisper. "Shadow." The dog's ears twitched, just for a second. They betrayed a flicker of recognition. Or perhaps curiosity. "Shadow, that's your name." The dog remained still, not accepting, not refusing, but the silence had changed. Just slightly, as if the wind outside had paused to reconsider how much cold the night truly needed. For hours, Jake sat there. He didn't read or sleep. He just watched the firelight dance on the old wooden walls. And the dog watched him, his eyes wide and ever-present. When a log popped with just the right sound, Shadow flinched. Jake said nothing, simply pulled another blanket over, resting his hand on its edge. Not touching, just near. Shadow watched that hand for long minutes, unmoving. Then, as if testing gravity, he shifted, just an inch, until the tip of his paw touched Jake's fingers. There was no thunder, no swelling music, just two lives that had been dragged down gravel roads finding each other in the softest, most fragile of moments. Morning came with frost on the windows and a forest still asleep. Jake didn't wake to a bark or a movement. He woke to warmth. Shadow had moved in the night, curling up by the hearth, closer to Jake. It wasn't trust yet, and it wasn't peace, but it was a start. And starts matter. Sometimes healing doesn't come with a thunderclap or a brilliant light. It comes in the quiet scrape of claws on old floorboards, in the shared breath of a man and a dog who have both seen too much, and in the silent agreement that maybe, just maybe, this cabin could hold more than just ghosts. The morning after their first night under the same roof was quiet. Like most mornings at the cabin in Hanamaki, outside, frost glittered on the pine needles as if someone had dusted the forest with silver. Inside, Jake brewed coffee strong enough to raise the dead, but his eyes weren't on his mug, they were fixed on Shadow, who was curled tightly by the hearth, one eye always open, never trusting sleep too deeply. Healing has a rhythm, and Shadow wasn't ready to join the dance. Jake sat and placed down a bowl of soft rice mixed with chicken and bone broth. But Shadow wouldn't move, not until Jake sat on the hard wooden floor beside him. Then, as if he'd learned that every touch was a betrayal, Shadow inched forward and began to eat. But only if Jake was near. He didn't eat like a starving stray. He paused between bites, watching the man, wary of the sound of boots, a raised voice, a hand lifted by mistake. As the days passed, Shadow's limp didn't improve. In fact, Jake noticed something worse. On the third afternoon, after a slow, careful walk in the yard, Jake tried to brush the matted fur near Shadow's hindquarters. That's when it happened. A single stroke near the bad leg, and Shadow twisted, a fearful growl erupting from his chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was a low, guttural warning. Jake froze, dropping the brush. Shadow backed away, trembling, tail tucked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Jake didn't yell or approach. He simply knelt, slowly, and held out his palm. Face up, he waited. Shadow didn't come back right away. Instead, he stood rigid at the edge of the rug, his eyes like those of a cornered animal. A full 10 minutes passed before he took a step, then another, and gently pressed the tip of his nose into Jake's hand. It was surrender, not trust, but the exhaustion of carrying the weight of his past. Later that night, as Jake carefully examined Shadow's body, checking for healed wounds, he found something strange under the fur. Not one, but several circular marks, old ones and new ones. Deliberate burns, placed precisely where a dog could neither scratch nor bite them away. Jake's hands stopped, the air caught in his throat. His face remained a mask, but his eyes told a story of cold anger, of guilt, and of something deeper. He said nothing, just closed his eyes for a moment, needing to steady himself against a reckless impulse. As the fire died down, Jake pulled a worn leather-bound notebook from under his bed, sat at the kitchen table, and picked up a pen. He wrote not for anyone to read, but like a man trying to set down a weight too heavy to carry. The ink flowed fast, the sentences fragmented. Names, places. Why didn't I say anything then? Why didn't I report it? Did I know you? Meanwhile, Shadow twitched in his sleep, letting out low whines and tiny yelps, as if trapped behind his own eyelids. Jake knelt quietly by the hearth and whispered, "You're not there anymore." Shadow's body shuddered once, then settled, The nightmare was over, but the questions remained, lingering like smoke. In the days that followed, more patterns emerged. Shadow flinched at the jangle of a chain. He scrambled under the table when Jake dropped a metal bowl. He would growl at the sight of a uniform, his fur bristling not at the person, but at the sight of a badge on a hat. These weren't random behaviors, they were scars stitched into his nervous system. Whatever had broken Shadow hadn't just broken his bones, it had broken his language, his trust, his memory. But there was something more, something Jake couldn't name, a look in Shadow's eyes when he watched him, not scared, not confused, but something like recognition that would wash over him and then recede. Never cresting, it was as if the dog wasn't learning someone new, but recognizing something he already knew. And Jake started to wonder if this wasn't a first meeting, but a reunion, and if the thing Shadow had run from wasn't just his past, but Jake's, too. In Jake's cabin, the nightly silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, weighted, as if the air itself knew secrets that had never been spoken. It was a silence born not from an absence of sound, but from a life that had already said too much. And one night, long past midnight, that silence was broken not by thunder or wind, but by 3 slow, heavy knocks on the door. Jake didn't move at first. Neither did Shadow, who had been dozing by the fire. They both lifted their heads at the same time, rigid, like soldiers on instinctual alert. Without a word, Jake moved to the door. Standing on the other side was a man in a brown canvas jacket with a gold badge pinned to it, Deputy Evans of the County Sheriff's Department. An acquaintance, but not a friend. "Sorry to bother you so late, Jake." Evans's voice was low. "Thought you should know. We had a call about a trespasser out at the old Vogel place. You remember it, right? You used to shoe horses out there." Jake stared, and then Shadow moved, stepping silently between the two men. His posture was tense, his growl a low rumble, ears pinned back. It was instant and unmistakable. Shadow hadn't reacted to the deputy, but to the name of the farm. Evans tipped his hat, left a business card on the railing, and departed without another word. Jake closed the door slowly, sliding the chain lock into place. For a long time, he just stood there, breathing. Shadow didn't move, just looked up at Jake, as if waiting for something to break. Later that night, Jake went to the shed out back. Shadow followed, his limp a little more pronounced in the cold air. The shed hadn't been opened in years. It smelled of rust, dust, and a past no one wanted to touch. Jake went straight to the back, pulled away a tarp, and revealed an old wooden footlocker, reinforced with iron corners. He took a deep breath before pulling it out, like a diver about to plunge into deep water, and opened it. Inside were fragments of a past life, worn army dog tags, a faded photograph of a younger Jake standing next to a border collie that looked a lot like Shadow, but was a different dog, a burnt leather collar, and there, wrapped in plastic, was a stack of old papers, receipts for work done at the farm, long forgotten, among them, the name Vogel, and a particular signature that made Jake's hand clench. Shadow watched him from the doorway, unblinking, unmoving, as if he knew what was in that box before Jake did. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Shadow, wrapped in a silence where the past didn't just knock. It threatened to break down the door. He knew he couldn't keep it buried anymore. Not the evidence, not the guilt, and not the name at the bottom of the receipt, a name he'd hoped never to see again. But it stared back at him like a mirror, offering no forgiveness. Something had started the day he raised his hand at the auction. It wasn't a rescue or an act of charity. It was a reckoning, and every step from here on out wouldn't be about healing, but about finding answers. As Shadow's nightmares suggested, the answers they were looking for might not be ones they wanted to find. Because what happened at the Vogel farm hadn't stayed buried. By morning, the frost on the roof had already melted, dripping in a slow, steady rhythm that didn't match Jake's mood. Sleep hadn't come. The footlocker was still open on the table. Shadow was restless, pacing near the front door, his claws clicking on the floorboards like a drum only he could hear. There was no spoken plan, but the man and the dog both knew where they were going. The road to the Vogel farm twisted through the outskirts of the Pennsylvania state forest. Pine trees arched overhead, casting long shadows on the gravel path. Jake drove the truck without a word. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, alert but silent, scanning the horizon as if something familiar might emerge from between the trees. The truck protested on the bumpy road, but neither of them flinched. An unspoken weight was riding with them. The old farm was a ghost. Faded fences, cracked windows, a barn whose roof was collapsing in on itself. But it was more than just derelict. It was a place people had left in a hurry, not because of time or nature, but because of something no one wanted to talk about. Jake stopped the truck and got out slowly. Shadow followed, his gait measured, the limp more noticeable on the uneven ground. They didn't go to the front door. Instead, Shadow led the way, ignoring a broken corral and a rusted horse trailer, moving toward a grassy clearing beyond the trees. There, Shadow stopped abruptly, his ears flattened, his body lowered, and he sniffed the dirt, pouring it at once. Then he looked up at Jake. There was a shallow depression in the ground, indistinct, as if something had once been buried there, not deep, not marked, just erased. Jake knelt, touching the ground. It was cold and damp. "Here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Shadow didn't bark or whine. He just let out a slow, heavy breath and sat beside him. The air grew thick. Jake closed his eyes for a long moment, remembering what he'd spent years trying to forget. The odd jobs, the quick cash, the sounds from a certain barn that were never spoken of again. But it was more than guilt. It was complicity. He hadn't done it, but he had been there. He had heard it, and he had walked away. Shadow leaned his head gently against Jake's shoulder, not pushing, just present. That small, quiet contact carried a forgiveness Jake didn't think he deserved. They sat like that for a long time, man and dog, side by side in the middle of a field filled with ghosts. But the silence didn't last. On their way back to the truck, a flicker of movement near the dilapidated barn caught Jake's eye. Someone, hiding quickly behind a rotten plank. Someone had been watching. Jake took a step forward, but a low growl from Shadow stopped him. Whoever it was never showed themselves again. Jake didn't pursue. Instead, he opened his glove box, took out a folded notepad, and wrote 3 words, "Not over yet." The drive back was even quieter, but the silence was no longer empty. It was buzzing with urgency. Jake knew this wasn't just about Shadow's past anymore. It was about his own responsibility, and the unfinished business that lurked in the shadows of forgotten paychecks and burned papers. Back at the cabin, Jake placed the muddy notepad on the table and began gathering old contacts. Names he hadn't spoken in years, ranchers, haulers, people who knew the underbelly that moved beneath the clean surface of the livestock business. And as the fire crackled behind him, Shadow curled up on the rug again, this time facing not the door, but Jake's back, because they were no longer 2 survivors. They were a single unit with a mission, and the truth was no longer buried. Jake wasted no time. The next morning, after just a few gulps of bitter coffee, he loaded Shadow into his pickup and headed east. The fragments of the previous night buzzed in his head, the shadow at the farm, the old fence posts that seemed to guard the graveyard's secrets. But what bothered him more was Shadow. The way he had whined by that shallow patch of earth. The way he looked at Jake as if he knew everything. The town was an hour away, the landscape flatter and more open, but Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened with every mile. He hadn't been to this veterinary clinic in years. Not since he and the vet, Dr. Aris Thorne, had stopped talking. There had been a lot of silences in his life, but if anyone could read the story hidden deep in a wound, it was her. When Jake walked through the door, the receptionist froze. She called for Dr. Thorne immediately, without even asking for a name. And then there she was, tall, sleeves rolled up, sharp eyes, wiping her hands on a clean rag. There was no smile. She didn't ask why he was there. Her gaze fell immediately to Shadow, who sat with a limp behind Jake, his body tense, looking between the 2 humans as if reading the very air. Aris approached slowly, wordlessly, and knelt, placing a hand near Shadow's neck. The fact that he didn't flinch told her more than anything else. "Jake," she said finally, standing up, "bring him in." In the sterile examination room, the mood shifted. Shadow was calm, allowing Aris to lift his leg and run a hand over his ribs. But when she gently parted the fur on his flank, she froze. "This isn't from offense," she murmured. "This is deliberate." Jake's heart slowed. "What do you mean?" Aris didn't look at him, her focus on the image on the screen, a ring of old scar tissue. She moved to his chest and found another. "This pattern is usually from a shock stick." The silence that followed was heavy. "A shock stick," Jake repeated, swallowing hard, his hands clenched on his knees. He remembered the rumors at the backwoods farms. Talk of breaking aggressive dogs, of using fear to make them either obey or become violent for sport. Aris stepped back from the table and exhaled. "This isn't just abuse, Jake. He was trained to survive something. No animal should be forced to do that." She pulled up the scanner. "He's got a chip." That changed everything. They both moved closer to the screen. The monitor flickered, pulling up a dusty digital record. Jake didn't breathe as a name materialized. Aris read it with hesitation. The dog was once registered to a livestock management facility, a place Jake knew well, a facility in the county that had been shut down 5 years ago. Connected to a man who rarely showed his face but always got what he wanted. Aris's voice broke on the final line. "Registered owner, Frank Vogel. Jake sat back, stunned. The name hit him like a freight train. Vogel, the man behind the scenes at the auctions. The man Jake had worked for during a dark time in his life. The man whose existence he had tried to forget. But Shadow hadn't forgotten. Shadow's eyes didn't blink. He tilted his head slightly, watching Jake with a quiet intensity, as if to say, "You already knew." Aris didn't speak again, just watched Jake quietly unravel in the corner of the room. He stood up slowly, moved to the door, and stopped. "Save the scan," he said. "Don't delete anything." Outside, the wind was picking up. Jake stood by his truck, closed his eyes, and whispered something only Shadow could hear. A name, a promise, because this was no longer about saving Shadow from his past. It was about making sure no one, on 2 legs or 4, was ever trapped by that same weight again. That night, Jake didn't sleep. The name from the file chased him, circling in his head, louder than the silence of the cabin. Frank Vogel. It wasn't just a memory, it was a door he had sealed shut with shame. Buried in a part of himself he never wanted to open again. But now that door was wide open. And on the other side, this dog was looking back at him, a mirror reflecting everything Jake had once walked away from. By sunrise, Jake was sitting on the porch with a thermos of lukewarm coffee. Shadow lay nearby, his head resting on Jake's boot, his breathing steady but still alert. The bond between them had changed. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. Shadow was a witness. Jake stood, went into the shed, and pulled out the footlocker he hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were the fragments of another life. A contractor's ID, old photos, pay stubs with Vogel's name on them. Evidence that wouldn't hold up in a court of law, but that a man's soul couldn't ignore. He had worked for Vogel once. Shoeing horses, fixing trailers, mending fences. That was the work on the surface. But underneath, there were whispers, the sound of dogs from a barn that was always padlocked. Dogs that arrived and never left. Jake had seen it, heard it, and done nothing. He needed the money. He looked away, and when the air grew heavy with the smell of smoke and screams, he left. And now that same evil had followed him all the way to a dusty auction in Pennsylvania. He made the call to Deputy Evans. The conversation was short, clipped, no questions, just an agreement to meet. In a quiet diner on the edge of town, surrounded by the illusion of normalcy, Jake laid it all out. No embellishments, no excuses, just the truth. "I know Vogel. I worked for him. I saw the cages." Evans's face was impassive, but his eyes narrowed. "Why now, Jake?" Jake didn't answer with words. He pulled out the photo from the vet's scan of Shadow's chip. A grainy image of a younger, thinner Shadow, standing inside a chain-linked kennel with a number painted on the wall behind him. Evans's expression cracked. "You bought him," he murmured, "at the auction." Jake nodded. "I didn't know then, but I do now." The deputy stroked his chin. Vogel vanished when his co-op went bust. No paper trail, no forwarding address, just melted into the woods. Jake leaned forward, his voice low. "I'll find him." Evans didn't ask how. He knew men like Jake. Quiet, scarred, but with a moral compass that pointed truer than most. "When you do, don't do anything stupid." A small, grim smile touched Jake's lips for the first time. Too late for that. When he got back to the cabin, Shadow was waiting. As Jake returned, Shadow stood without a command and moved to the door. He knew, too, this was no longer just about healing. It was about a reckoning. The next day, Jake packed the truck. Not much. Some rope, a first aid kit, flashlights, and an old revolver he hadn't touched in years. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, as if he had done this in another life. They didn't speak on the way out of town. They didn't need to. The wind whistling through the pines carried all the words that mattered. Frank Vogel had built a kingdom on silence and pain. But now, the silence was coming for him, with teeth and a past that could not be outrun. The drive back to the Vogel farm was silent, but it was a silence that said everything. Shadow sat tall in the passenger seat, staring at the road as if he knew exactly where they were going. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight with a quiet fury that only those who have lived with guilt for a long time can understand. The past wasn't behind them anymore. It had circled around and was waiting for their final move. As they reached the turnoff near the edge of the state forest, the clouds hung heavy and low over the trees. The old gate still hung crookedly, flakes of rust falling like dead leaves. Jake parked without turning off the engine. The air was thick, electric, as if the forest was holding its breath. Shadow was the first one out, determined despite his limp, nose down, ears swiveling like radar. They didn't speak, just followed the same path. Past the broken fence, past the charred remains of a stable where no animal had lived for years, and toward the spot where Shadow had cried out. And there it was again. The place. But this time, Shadow didn't whine, he dug. Jake knelt and dug with him. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Their hands hit something hard. A small metal box with a rusted latch, wrapped in rotting canvas. For a moment, Jake's heart hammered like a drum against his ribs. He opened the box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of dogs, scarred and caged. Some were barely recognizable. There were papers, too, payout ledgers, auction slips, a notepad filled with dates and procedures. And there, a list of names. Jake scanned it until he found his own, next to an entry that read, iron and hauling. No questions asked. The breath left his body. Shadow's paw scratched at the edge of the box again. Jake looked down and saw another photograph had slipped under the stack. It was different from the others. Not as faded. It was a picture of Shadow. Younger and thinner. A chain around his chest with a tag that read 1479. Jake looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back, not with accusation, but with recognition, and something deeper, as if he had waited his whole life for this moment, for someone to witness what had been done to him and to act. With a trembling hand, Jake stood and packed the box into a canvas bag. They left the farm without another word, but the fire burning in Jake's chest now had a shape. It was a mission. Back in town, Jake took Shadow and walked straight into the sheriff's office. Evans met them at the door. One look at Jake's face, and he knew, what they had been waiting for had arrived. Jake placed the bag on the desk. "This is everything," he said. That evening, the search was renewed. Vogel's name spread like a disease through the agencies. Warrants were issued. Old case files were reactivated. What had been buried in the shadows was now under a spotlight in the center of town. Unavoidable. The next morning, as a light snow dusted the sidewalks, Jake and Shadow walked out of the station. People stopped. Some recognized them from the viral auction video weeks ago. A few approached but didn't speak right away. Just watched the man and his dog walk through town. They looked like they belonged now. Jake looked down at Shadow and asked, "Ready to go home?" Shadow gave a single, soft wag of his tail. They weren't heading back to the cabin. They were headed to a new place Jake had been quietly preparing. A small piece of land on the outskirts of town. A place where a chain would never touch a neck again. Where dogs could come to heel, to run, to rest. Shadow would be the first resident. No longer just a survivor, but a guardian. Because in the end, some stories aren't about survival. They're about return, about one broken soul choosing to hold up another, until you can no longer remember which one was saving which. And as for Vogel, that was a different road. But now he was being hunted, just as he once hunted others. Jake and Shadow didn't look back. They didn't need to. They had already turned their pain into a purpose. And in the wind that followed them, the past had finally let go. 88.1s